I tell people all the time, I joined the Army to see the world, and I lived in Kansas, Virginia, and Missouri.
Were there
Four kids.
interstate systems at that point?
Well, we went across Canada.
Okay.
So by the time we got to British Columbia, it was a dirt road from British Columbia to Alaska. That probably sums up what it's like being in a family like that. Everything was an adventure. I went to 3 high schools. And you learn to adapt. But also spent some time in South Africa, Russia, Indonesia, the UK, and just had Canada. Had an incredible experience with people. Whenever you're spending other people's money, I think you have a responsibility to make sure that you're not wasteful and that you want to give them the atmosphere that they need and want, but you also don't have the blank check to go do whatever you want.
You're listening to Wonderful Life with Tom Rohr. From Rogers to Bedford Falls, from Fayetteville to Pottersville, we're discovering how one person's life can have an effect on so many others. My guest today is Rick Parker. Rick is someone who thinks that you're a good egg even when he knows that you're slightly cracked. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
It's good to have you with us here today. So our audience can get to know you a little bit better. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your family?
Okay. Well, my wife and I both come from military families and moved around the country and actually the world when we were kids. But our parents settled in Colorado Springs, and although we didn't go to the same high school or know each other in school, we met each other when we were in college. I was home from West Point, and she was home from Colorado State University, and my brother actually introduced us, and from there we just kind of hit it off and had a great time. We actually met on St. Patrick's Day, so that's a good omen. We had a great time getting to know each other for over a year, and then we got married in 1985. From there, I was in the military. I tell people all the time, I joined the Army to see the world, and I lived in Kansas, Virginia, and Missouri. But, there were great times for us. Left the military and ended up moving to Northwest Arkansas. We had our first daughter. She was a year old when we moved here, Jennifer. We had a son, James, 4 years later. And we pretty much have made this our home for the last 28 years. We started at St. Vincent de Paul. Our kids went to school there, graduated from, at that time, it only went to 6th grade. And they both graduated from high schools here. My daughter's a Mountie. My son's a War Eagle. So we went, when they were split, high schools. They both went on and went to college. My son went to the U of A. Got a degree in political science. My daughter went to University of Colorado Springs, where she met her husband, Nick Reed. They're married now and have a young daughter, Caroline. Another great, interesting story. She is named after the 8th inning song. If you've ever been to a Red Sox game, we had a great time at my 55th birthday, and she is the blessing from that evening. And from there...
And that's a Sweet Caroline.
Sweet Caroline. Okay. You got it. Neil Diamond.
Okay.
And someday we'll take her back and let 35,000 people sing to her. We've lived here, like I said, for the last 28 years. My daughter's now a nurse here at Mercy. My son lives in Washington, D.C., but he'll be relocating here probably in the next 6 months or so and starting up a business.
You have siblings? Tell us a little bit about your parents,
I have,
too.
My parents were both born in Boston. That's kind of where we have most of our relatives. And on my side of the family, my wife's Marianne, her family's from New York, so a lot of her family is also on the East Coast. But I have 2 brothers and a sister. They all live in Colorado, my mom and dad, who are both still alive. And Marianne's dad lives in Colorado, and she has 3 brothers and a sister. She had an older brother who passed away years ago. So that's kind of our family background.
Yeah. Did Marianne's family travel around a little bit too?
Oh, yeah. Marianne, her dad was in the military, as I said, and they lived in Germany for quite a while. And they also, Marianne was actually born in Italy during one of those times. She actually has a dual citizenship. So they lived around not only the United States, but also in Europe.
So it just so happened that your two families were there in Colorado when you met in '85. Then
That's it. My younger brother was born in Augsburg, Germany. Who would have thought? People have lived all over the place, either the world or the United States would meet like that. But yeah, that's where we met.
What's that like? Growing up in that kind of family and knowing that you're going to move around and.
Well, I think for me, and I can't speak for Marianne, but I think it would be very similar. It's always an adventure. Everything we did was an adventure. I mean, I'll give you one trip that summed it all up. We lived in Massachusetts at one point. My dad was going to be, his job in the military was going to change from being an instructor at Northeastern in ROTC to a unit in Alaska. So my dad, in typical fashion, decided we would drive from Massachusetts to Alaska back in, I think at the time it was 1972.
Wow.
30-day trip, two dogs,
were there
four kids.
Interstate systems at that point?
Well, we went across Canada.
Okay.
So by the time we got to British Columbia, it was a dirt road from British Columbia to Alaska. We went through British Columbia, Yukon territories, and then into Alaska. Like I was just saying, the beauty of the trip was, though, is my dad had bought a Chevy Blazer. We had 4 kids in a Blazer with 2 dogs, and you can just imagine the trip, the smells, just the fun of that trip. And we pulled a 22-foot trailer, so we just stopped every night and just parked wherever.
And you found your way without GPS, too.
We found our way without GPS. A fun story with that, my dad always, I typically would do the map, and it was one of those things where you realize you learned a lot from doing that, and it was always keeping track of it from those big atlases we used to have. My dad was very meticulous about keeping track of the mileage and the gas and all that. But yeah, that probably sums up what it's like being in a family like that. Everything was an adventure. I went to 3 high schools, and you learn to adapt.
That has to be hard, though. Moving somebody when they're in high school.
I think we make a bigger deal out of it today than it was then.
So you weren't mad?
Oh, no, never.
Okay.
Never. I don't think I ever got upset about moving. You always were sad to leave your friends, but you learned how to make friends, and you just kind of kept going. And I think that also defines you later on in life. You adapt better. You're more resilient to change. And it has that kind of effect on you.
So in your family, and I want to make sure I state this right, did you have, were you or your any of your relatives in active duty?
Oh, yeah.
Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's right. So Marianne's father was active duty over 20 years. He retired as a colonel. My dad was active duty over 22 years. He retired as a first sergeant and 2 tours in Vietnam. Marianne's dad was actually in World War II in the 10th Mountain Division, and then he also was deployed for a period of time after the Korean War in Korea. So they were both 20 years. My brother, I had one brother who was in the Army for over 5 years, a paratrooper in the 82nd. On Marianne's side, she's got nephews who are still in the Air Force. So yeah, we have a fairly strong military background. And then I spent 5 years in the military after I went to West Point.
Now, were you actually engaged in another country in an operation?
The only time I did anything personally was during the 80s. I was in an engineering battalion, and we went down to Central America. And I didn't have to do any kind of active kind of warfare or anything like that, but we supported building bases and infrastructure, so I didn't really have to do anything like that. And we had a unit down there, and I would only go down periodically, for a couple days at a time, maybe a couple times a year.
Yeah.
But no, I never had to do that. I would say it's interesting, but I would say I was blessed during the time I was in. We weren't really in any active engagements. We had a couple of smaller things, but nothing like today.
Right. So when the family all gets together and you have generations that have been involved that way, do you talk about things? Do you tell stories about?
Oh, yeah. I think that's one of the common threads of the family.
Well, why don't you share like one of your favorite stories? Or maybe one of the stories that one of your relatives tell.
I think for us, the stories aren't about necessarily being in the military. You're the person that's in the military. It's about the things you got to do while you were you were at a place. And like I said, the trip to Alaska, we constantly talk about. Marianne's family talks about, spending summers on the Italian coast when they lived in Germany, because that's where you went when you lived in Germany. You went to Italy. And it's more about talking about the life that you shared. And you don't dwell too much on the other things. We do talk about them, but they're more, I would say, just things that we each did individually, but you talk more collectively about the family experience.
And that just has to add a whole nother dimension as far as understanding the world and different people in the world and the things that you've seen.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think, Marianne's family was very close to some folks in Germany and Italy. Her father actually took her and her sister back because his father, Marianne's grandfather, came from Italy. There's these ties that are just created because you are more accustomed to talking about things outside the United States. So, yeah, it builds this desire to want to do and see things outside the United States and see the world.
Yeah. You've had a long Walmart career, and I know in your Walmart career you worked in Walmart International.
I did.
Yeah, tell us about some of the places that you where you worked and some of the things that you saw.
Sure. Like I just started with the joke about joining the military to see the world, and I basically was stationed in the United States. I joined Walmart to stay home and be with my family, and I saw the world. I spent 10 years out of the 28 years I was at Walmart in International. Spent a lot of time in South America, Mexico, Central America, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. But also spent some time in South Africa, Russia, Indonesia, the UK, and just had Canada. Had an incredible experience with people. For me, it also solidified my faith in my understanding of the universal church. Some of the most incredible stories I have about being Catholic are from being in Latin America or trying to find a church in Russia on a Sunday, which I couldn't, by the way. I looked and looked and looked, and I had the address, but no one could tell me how to get there. Okay. Very interesting dichotomy, because you'd see these old Byzantine churches and you knew the faith was there, you just couldn't find it. So to me, it symbolizes Russia.
Okay, so they would look different than church here?
The Byzantine churches, definitely. Most of us have seen the pictures of the Eastern Church with the icons and all that. And it is very, it's a different kind of spirituality, but it's you can tell that it's rooted in.
But I think about like the big round domes,
the domes,
the pointy.
They're pointed with the gold domes.
Is that everywhere, or
you can definitely see that quite a bit in Russia? I mean, they at one point I know they tried to wipe the church out, but there's still a lot there.
Okay.
And like you can go inside the Kremlin and see where the czars are encased or entombed there, and it's an old church, so it's there. But like I said, it's just like it feels in Russia. It's hidden. You got to find the faith, though. You can see the buildings. You got to find the faith.
Right.
But in Latin America, totally different experience. Like I said, some of the most incredible days I had, I was sitting in Nicaragua in their cathedral, and the Bishop of Nicaragua showed up, the President of Nicaragua. It so happened it was the day that Pope Benedict was announced the Pope, and it was a very joyous day in that cathedral, and I remember that day very vividly. Some incredible experiences in Brazil, where you would go to a grotto. This church was actually on the side of a hill. Very spiritual service. Almost remind you of a evangelical type service. I mean, people were singing and waving hands, and I mean, it was definitely it was a Catholic church, but
spirit-filled,
very spirit-filled, and a lot of fun. And I don't really speak Portuguese or Spanish, a little bit of Spanish sometimes, but that's where I learned it doesn't matter, because you can feel the faith, you can enjoy the faith, you can be a part of the faith, and it almost reminds you of like the fact that we really are one body. Those experiences I will never forget. I got to go to Our Lady of Guadalupe's Cathedral in Mexico City, one of the most incredible spiritual moments of my entire life. It is exactly what people say. People were crawling on stones to get to the cathedral. Masses, it's not even perpetual adoration. It's like perpetual mass. It's like 18 hours a day of mass, 1 hour after another. I tell everybody, if you go to mass and you can feel electricity, it feels like, 120. This was like 440, 220. I mean, it was like being plugged into the washer dryer outlet in your house. It was a whole nother level of just Holy Spirit that was just incredible. And I also got to Juan Diego's home that's also outside the city. It's a little cave almost. It's not what you would think. It's not a house. It's more like a little grotto where he lived.
He lived in.
That's what I saw there. Yes,
okay.
And it's out by Cuautitlán. I had a taxi driver who I got to know who knew I was Catholic, and he brought me out there one day before work and showed me it, and very interesting. Another really fun experience I had was in Argentina. It was a Saturday afternoon. Just a lot of pretty churches. And so and some of them are 300, 400, 500 years old, based on when the Spanish actually and the Portuguese were doing some of their voyages and things down in Latin America. But I was in Buenos Aires, and I decided, well, I'm just going to go to church. And you have your pick. I mean, there's like one every 3 or 4 blocks. And I go up to this church. It's a Saturday afternoon. And I thought, well, I'll just do a rosary. So I'm sitting there, and I will tell you, it's like anywhere else in the world. There's like a half dozen 70-year-old women praying the rosary. Well, I was sitting there, and in broken Spanish, we started talking back and forth after we finished the rosaries. She was telling me her son brings her to church every Saturday. He's a good boy, but he doesn't really go to church. He's in the back waiting for her. And we just had a lot of fun. Out of that, someone came out of the back of the rectory, or out of the back of the church, and they said, "Hey, would you like to do the readings today in Spanish?" I was like, "Oh, no." In very broken Spanish, I said, "No, you don't want me to do that." But it just showed me how we connect with our faith. It was an incredible moment of, like I said, I didn't speak very good Spanish, they didn't speak very good English, but the whole thing was centered around our relationship and being Catholic. It was just a great thing. And so many more stories like that. I went in a 500-year-old church in Brazil with some of the paintings still there. That was in the northeastern portion where the Portuguese first landed, and just some incredible history.
Is there different, say, the art within the church like that, in a Portuguese church versus a Spanish language church?
No, that's a great question. It's not something that really struck me. Once again, it's that feeling of just being Catholic. Every church had an altar, every church had a crucifix. At the front of the church. I mean, you just never. Some of them had the Stations of the Cross. Some of them are a little more colorful. The one in Nicaragua was probably, even though it was a cathedral, probably the most austere of all. Concrete floors, wooden benches, and it was a cathedral, but it was big, and it was there so people could come. Nothing really struck me as that part of it as being different.
Now, you got to travel to Africa also, didn't you? What was that like?
South Africa. Once again, you get these opportunities to do a lot of things. I went to the site where they dug out Lucy down by Johannesburg, but probably one of the influential things I think in my life was getting to go see where Nelson Mandela was kept prisoner down off of Cape Town on a little island. This actually happened on a Sunday, and I felt bad because I honestly didn't get to Mass that day. But I decided to do this trip, and I would tell you it was probably one of the most, I don't think I could have heard a better sermon than what I heard for a story there. So when you go to the island there, today they actually have the tours given by the guards or by inmates that were kept at the island during the time that Nelson Mandela was there. And they've actually become friends. And they talk you through the experience. They take you around the whole island and tell you what happened at each place. They tell you about Nelson Mandela, but they tell you about how he bred this forgiveness and how most of the guards and the prisoners became friends. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that Nelson Mandela said you had to forgive, that, they're just guards, they're just doing their job. And as long as someone wasn't, evil in their intent, the inmates understood. There were some people that were not very nice, and a lot of those disappeared. But the ones that just were, they had a job. They were just, and they treated the inmates to some extent civil. That allowed that forgiveness to be easy. But that whole story of forgiveness and the fact that as you travel to Africa, one of the things that you really realize is there's been so many civil wars, there's been so many coups, there's been a lot of blood shed in that country because of different nationalities, religions, races. And Nelson Mandela was able, through that idea of forgiveness, to probably create one of the few nations that didn't go through that bloodshedding like the other countries did.
Okay. And it seems like it's had somewhat of a lasting effect, too.
Oh, yeah, I think so. Even with the troubles they have today, they all know they have to live together, and it's not conducive for either side to try to, not work together. So, and it's had a big impact on me. I think we learn a lot, and we hear a lot about forgiveness in our faith.
Yeah.
But you do see the fruits of forgiveness if you visit somewhere like that. Yeah. Probably like a Gandhi or something like that. That's the way I looked at Nelson Mandela, and why he's such a great man.
Right. And he had to deal with that at some point, or he could have never accomplished what he accomplished after he was out.
I agree. And, if you read his history, you'll find that, he was associated with some acts that probably were fairly violent and things, but over time, there's a lot of us. And that's why I love the quote you started with about everybody's a good egg, but we're all a little cracked. We all have our story. We're all imperfect. But we're all on a journey. And, we try to keep the egg together, even though we're cracked, right? Without letting the yolk run all over the place. And I think Nelson Mandela is a great example of that, where I think over time he changed as he got older, and he realized that maybe what he did when he was younger felt like the right thing to do, but over time as he aged, he realized there was a better way to do it.
Right. Okay, so I want to get back closer to the present and in town here. I know you do a lot of work with veterans, and also you're a West Point grad, correct?
Yep.
So you there's an application process with that you help people with?
Yeah. For veterans, for me, probably the biggest thing I do is, and that I enjoy the most, is every on Veterans Day, or they have a very nice ceremony down at the Fayetteville National Cemetery, where you can lay wreaths on all of the tombs of soldiers. And one of the things I've always wanted to do was go to Arlington and do that. Actually, it was last November I actually got the chance to do that. And it makes you once again feel so good about the country and the people. There were probably about 80,000 people out there. We laid over 250,000 wreaths in a morning at the Arlington National Cemetery. I really feel like that's something we need to remember, that people sacrificed for us. Just as a Catholic, we understand what Jesus did for us. So have people done that for our country. A different way, different cause, but same kind of feel of that self-sacrifice.
So tell us a little bit about Arlington. There's probably a person or two that maybe has heard of Arlington Cemetery, but wouldn't know who's there.
Sure. Well, that's where John F. Kennedy was buried. Most people will probably be familiar with the pictures of the horses drawn coffin of JFK, and where they were taking him was to Arlington. Many soldiers from just since the Civil War and before are buried in that cemetery. It's just a very reverent place, and it's just if you are an American, and people always talk about going and seeing the monuments or going to the White House, I would recommend you go to Arlington, because you really get a sense of the history of the country and what people did for it.
So tell us about West Point applications.
Sure, I've been doing that for almost 20 years. In that time, I don't know, probably we tend to get about 3 or 4 young men and women into the academy every year, or probably around 3. And so in that time, I probably 40 or 50 different young people here in Northwest Arkansas. There are still some that are in the military, and there are some that have already started getting out of the military. But I want to give people, especially the young kids, the same opportunities I had. I grew up in a very middle-class type of family. I was the first person in my family to actually go to college and finish college. One of my brothers also did. My sister also did. But, it gave me an opportunity to do something I probably couldn't have done. And I want to give that same opportunity to people here. I think it defines a lot of who I am as a person. The motto at West Point is duty, honor, country. And I just want to give kids that want that opportunity to serve the country that opportunity, because it's a great education. It's something that will definitely shape you as a person.
Okay. And so at that point in your life when you were ready to apply, was there someone who helped you?
Yeah, there was. I actually had a next door neighbor. He was retired Colonel Horace Demarest. And there are always people in your life that you owe a lot to. He would probably be one of, today we use the word mentor. He was probably the first mentor I had in my life. I was 18 years old then, and he really helped me understand that I could do this, because I was actually going to college at another university, and I wasn't sure if I could get into West Point, but he really encouraged me, helped me by writing some letters, and just did a great job of getting me to understand I could do it. And that's what I'm trying to do with the kids that I have here. I never tell a kid that they can't go, but I do tell kids, you may need to work harder. It may take another year, because it took me 2 years. And sometimes kids don't want to hear that, but I think some of them, it's the first time in their life they're being told, hey, you're going to need a couple more classes, or you're going to need to do this. I've actually had some kids come back after a year or two and apply and get in. So that makes me feel good. And I always want to give all the kids a chance. I run into some incredible students who go to Harvard, Stanford.
So you don't have
West
to give
Point.
you don't have to give names or anything. Well, but why don't you tell us a story or two of your favorite stories of someone who was able to get into West Point?
So we had one young man out of Fort Smith. His family came over as Vietnamese refugees back in the 70s. Incredible story, but not your traditional family story here. He helped with the family business. He very much was a part of the family dynamic and had a responsibility. So when you looked at his resume versus other kids' resume, it looked different. But he was very smart. And even though he'd lived here, you could tell his family was still very, very Southeast Asian, Vietnamese. Mm-hmm. And we really just loved his story, loved the fact that him and his family loved this country. If I remember correctly, he went to a prep school for 1 year and then went to West Point and got in. And same kind of thing. We just could not have picked a better person to represent Northwest Arkansas or the young people of Arkansas. But he was willing to go a year and make that sacrifice before he could get in. And I've had other stories with where we've done that with other young adults where we've sent them off for a prep school for a year and then they've reapplied. Or actually, one young man went to the U of A. But one of my favorite stories would be Vietnam. The other one would be once again everybody wants to talk about people coming to the country. We're still a country where opportunity is incredible. I met a young lady whose parents came from Honduras. It was Honduras. And once again, I was very familiar with that time frame of when her parents left, because that's when I was active in the military, and I know that Central America was very bad. And for us in the church, we know about the martyrdom of the priests from Oklahoma. It just was not good. Mm-hmm. So they left, there. They brought their daughter here, and I believe she was actually born here, if I remember right. She was, and but she got into West Point and just thrived. So opportunity is there for anybody.
Yeah. So what does West Point look for in an individual that gets accepted?
Sure. I think the biggest thing that people don't understand is, versus like if you're applying to a Harvard or an MIT, grades are probably the biggest thing. They are looking for community involvement and things like that. But I would say at West Point, they really are looking for a very well-rounded individual. You need to have shown some ability in athletics, leadership, and in school, and be active in the community. And they want to see all of those things. And those are the kind of kids that are getting in, the ones that excel in all those areas.
Yeah. And it's really the best of the best to a certain degree, huh?
I would tell you, every year I probably get about 30 applicants. Out of that, about 12 to 15 are serious. And like I said, 2 to 3 get in out of this area.
Wow. Okay. So, Rick, you've been talking about how you're active in your church. In Northwest Arkansas, the growth has been amazing. So I know you have been active at your church with your finance commission, but you've also been involved in building a new church and now expanding a church. Can you tell us a little bit about your work in that area?
Sure. Actually, I'll really start with when we first moved here. We were in what is now Paul Hall, was the church. It really did.
And that was a church about what size? 500 people?
Yeah,
maybe?
I was going to say on a good day, 500, standing room only. And then we had a little cry room off to the side. And it was right off of the altar. And it just wasn't really a great situation. And so over time, myself, back then the Pappases, Dr. Pappas, many people may know Gene and Dr. Pappas, and myself and Marianne and a few others, we started the first children's ministry, where we actually would go over to the school, and one of the sisters had given us this little roller cart of stuff we could bring out, and they gave us one little room, and we started that, and that was one of the first ministries we were actually involved in, and we started from there, and my wife became very involved in the school from that. I did some things on parish council to begin with in the education area. But to your point, over time, I still don't know why Monsignor Richard did this, but I think I was only 30 and I couldn't understand why he'd want a 30-year-old on the finance council. But I don't know if it was just that balance or whatever of young people that were coming in. But I ended up going on the council, and I was part of the, not the church itself, but some expansion projects and some other things that happened on there. I've spent a lot of time either on the council or in the finance commission. The other thing that I did was I was on the school board, and I did do the expansion of at the time it was Christine Grelli was the principal. We did the expansion onto the school that added, I think it was 5 or 6 classrooms. So I did do that, and now I'm on for the last 3 years. I've been on the building committee and the growth committee for the church, where we're going to build on the administrative areas.
Also in this area, most people aren't from here. Many of them come and then they expect to leave. How do you get folks motivated to build things like that and invest in those type of projects?
We're blessed in that way. I think people that come in from outside the area, most of them come from areas that are, their faith is pretty strong, and they recognize that if you don't do these things, even if they're only going to live here 5 years or 10 years, their kids aren't going to be able to go to school if they want to go to the Catholic school. They're not going to have the kind of services they want. They're not going to be able to have the kind of programs they want for their kids. You're not going to have the ministries you want for outreach. And I think we've been blessed that way. Most people that come in, I've seen people come and go. People have still been active. I wouldn't say it's fair to say that those who have stayed the longest have given the most. I think I've seen a blend of all types. So that's been my experience in 28 years. I've seen a number of people have come and go, but they've been active when they're here. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's faith.
Yeah.
It's not me. It's not what anybody does. Right. It's their faith.
Yeah. Well, but we're blessed to have folks like you involved in that and keep that moving. Now, I know you have a engineering background. You also have a lot of history, whether it's within your profession or also in ministry and building things. Mm-hmm. What expertise do you bring to these type of projects?
Well, first is whenever you're spending other people's money, I think you have a responsibility to make sure that you're not wasteful and that you want to give them the atmosphere that they need and want, but you also don't have the blank check to go do whatever you want as a person. You need to listen to people. And so I try to blend that listening to people, what do they really want, with understanding what things cost. And you start having good conversations with engineers, with architects, with construction people. And because of my background, I'm able to ask those kind of questions where, maybe we can save a couple $1,000s here, or maybe we want this to look a little nicer over here, and we blend those things together. So I've really enjoyed that kind of work. Or when we expanded on the building, we looked at all kinds of options with Christine Grelli, and we really came down to the best thing to do was to add on. But we looked at all kinds. We even looked at these portable classroom things and all kinds of stuff. And I think it just allows options to be really vetted before you just go and do something. Most of the people I've talked to, when I tell them, what they're getting with the administrative buildings and some of the things we've done to make sure that we keep the costs prudent, I've been very, very receptive to. And a lot of that came with, I've had questions about, well, why don't we have 2 stories on this? Well, what we found out was to add another story, we actually got about the same square footage, if not a little less. But because of the need for elevators, more hallways, more exits, and all of that, you actually end up spending more money for less square footage. And so by building 1 story, we get what we need. And for a long time, we were very prudent with the parishioners' money and saved, I would say, at least not quite 10%, but probably about 8% on the package of the project because we did things like that. Now I'm not saying that was me; that was a group of us who understood that.
Yeah. Did you have a role of engaging the architect or any of the construction people?
I really work with the building. It's been Kevin Carter, who was here for a while. He's left the parish. You talk about people that come and go, they still give. Kevin Carter is a great example of that. He's been here and back twice now, and he still gives. But Don Span is kind of the lead, and Cinderelli, and I work with them mainly. I try to attend meetings with them if I can. And,
okay,
but
you speak the language.
Yeah. It's like I may not speak Spanish very well, but I speak this language pretty well.
And you understand what's behind the wall and what quality is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's very helpful, very handy to have that around on big projects like that. Yeah. Okay. Well, now I know that you and Marianne also do some work and donate some funds to child support centers.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
We years ago, there really wasn't. If you go out and look at the Northwest Children's Center now that they have out west of Bentonville, towards the airport. The facility they had years ago was just very small. It wasn't very inadequate. And Marianne and I, we recognized that as the community grew, there were a lot of opportunities for children who were in distress. And I don't know why, but it was probably about 15 years ago we started to give, and we've been giving. I think we're at a point in our lives where we want to give back, maybe and volunteer more. With Marianne's background in teaching and even Jennifer's in nursing. I think as a family, that's something we've talked about, but it has been more monetary. I think most of our child advocacy kind of things is Marianne working at the school, and really that has been her I think gift to the community, to the Catholic community. She worked there, but I can tell you, she's probably volunteered as much time as she's worked there for kids or for just things that they're doing there.
Yeah. So what are the main issues that you see, and what should people know about the need for support in that area?
Yeah, I think what people don't understand is, and a lot of times we read in the paper, a couple got arrested for meth, or a couple. Or someone was involved in a violent altercation at home. What is not reported is that a lot of times there are 2 or 3 or 4 children involved in that. Well, whenever that happens, basically the court's order is that the children have to be removed till the situation is resolved, either through the courts or through some other means. And so those children have to be taken somewhere immediately. And the only place they have today is that shelter. And the shelter that we have out here now actually can handle infants all the way up to teenage boys and girls. And I'm not as familiar with some of this, but I know they have to keep, there's a separation at a certain age, and there's only a certain age that they can keep boys and young women up to 18. So, but those are the things that are not reported in the paper. People don't understand it. There's not a lot of funding for that. Matter of fact, I believe this center is the only one that has infants in like the surrounding counties. So it doesn't just do Benton County. So those are the things I don't think people, when they read the paper, they don't read that in there. But I'm sure now, I hope that when people read the article, they think, wow, I wonder if there were any kids involved. Because if there were, that's where they probably are.
Yeah. And then it's heartbreaking to think the unintended consequences that happens,
and
in
think
people's
about
lives.
that for a child. I mean, you're there with your parents. No matter what the conditions were, you're still with your parents, and then you're taken from your parents, and you may not see them, again for a while.
Well, Rick, I appreciate your passion, and I know our community is better for having you here. So I do have a couple more questions in the lightning round.
Yeah.
You ready?
Sure.
3 questions today.
Go ahead.
All right. The first is what advice would you give a 20-year-old Rick now if you could go back and talk to yourself when you were 20?
Well, all eggs are good. They're just a little cracked. I think everybody's don't judge people. Everybody's got a story. Try to find out what their story is before you make that leap of judgment. I get asked this question a lot. Would I change? My life is blessed. I would say recognize that it's a journey, and don't try to force the plan. Just accept that things are going to change, and that you may think it's a straight highway, but it might be a curved road. You may still get to the same spot, but don't get so uptight when things change, or don't go to your plan. God's plan is the plan.
Yeah. Well, and I'm struck with you were talking earlier about how Mandela had changed over time, probably reflected back on a younger self, and was in a different place and had a different view as he grew older and wiser.
Yeah, I will tell you, like I said, it probably goes back to the first statement about judging. My journey would have, my 20-year-old self would have said, hey, I'm good with the death penalty. I'm not sure I really understand abortion that much. The whole right to life thing is something that I would want a 20-year-old Rick to understand better. Yeah. And it's someplace I am today that I wasn't when I was 20.
Yeah, and we're both dealing with parents that are older, and it's hard, and there's not good solutions to that. Yeah. So, life is precious.
That's right.
Okay, second question. Tell us the last good movie that you saw or a book you read.
Okay. Well, I just read Shackleton's Way.
Okay.
He was an explorer who never made it to the South Pole, but his claim to fame was his ship was the ship that got stuck in the ice for a year. And the story is none of the men died. And they lived on the ice, and then they had to take a journey on boats, and then he had to take another journey on a boat to get to an island where he could tell people that the rest of the crew was stranded. And when he got to that island, he was on the wrong side of the island. He had to climb a mountain to get over to the other side. Wow. It's a fascinating story about being positive in life and just keeping going, but also keeping those around you moving forward and not letting that negativity in your life grow. But it's a fascinating, Shackleton's Way. It's more of a leadership book, but there are many stories written about Shackleton. I would highly encourage people, if you think your life is tough, read the book.
Wow.
I mean, to be stranded on an ice floe with your boat, and the boat actually was crushed and sank at some point in the story. And so all they had then were the little rescue boats off the side, all that. And it's just a fascinating story. So that would probably be that. And then the movie I saw was, and then people are going to think I'm crazy, and I definitely date myself, but it was the documentary on Mr. Rogers. And
I did not see that. Was that good?
Oh, it's incredible. It's incredible. Won't You Be My Neighbor?
Okay.
And it was fascinating. And he was an ordained Presbyterian. I think it was Presbyterian minister. Mm-hmm. And if you watch the show, his whole show is really about teaching children that they're loved, and that love is the most. And what does this sound like? If for all of us, listen to the sermons from Monsignor David, love is the essence of the Bible, and he wanted that, but he never pushed that part of it, but he pushed the love part.
Right.
And it's a great movie, and in today's world where nobody can say a kind word about anybody else in the papers or on TV, it is a movie everybody should see, because it really gets to the crux of the problems in our country. Yeah. But it's just a fabulous movie.
Yeah. Well, and we like old movies on the show. So, Wonderful Life was black and white.
Okay.
So, all right, last question.
Yeah.
You've been given an elephant.
Yeah.
You can't give it away or sell it. What would you do with the elephant?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I would do is read a book on how to take care of an elephant, because I wouldn't know what to do with an elephant or how to take care of it. I think the second thing you'd have to do is find a place big enough. I mean, our house is not big enough, so I'd probably have to buy some land. And then I think the third thing is I'd probably build the land in a way where kids could come out and play with the elephant or ride the elephant or have that experience with an elephant. But first thing I'd do is buy a book to learn how to take care of an elephant.
Well, if anybody could handle that situation, Rick, you'd be able to do that. Well, thank you so much for being part of the show today. We really have enjoyed getting to know you a little bit better.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate the time.
Okay, and thank you for tuning in to Wonderful Life. And remember, the only thing that you can take with you is that which you give away. This is Tom Rohr, the richest man in town, signing off till next time.
This is the Padua Podcast Network. PaduaMedia.com.